slatki raju moj, zašto mi kratiš mili pogled tvoj? Marice, dušo, slatki raju moj, zašto mi kratiš mili pogled tvoj?
You're listening to folk song from the coastal part of Croatia that was recorded in 1954. My name is Dora, and today I'll be talking about production of ethnic records on Croatian territory throughout the decade after the Second World War. At that time, Croatia belonged to Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, along with 6 other neighboring countries. Since Yugoslavia was basically an entity per se, it is important to emphasize that I will not present Croatian, but Yugoslav ethnic record production. The presentation is a result of still lasting research that aimed to present early years of Jugoton Record Company with regards to traditional or folk music. It is relevant to say that record production on the Yugoslavian territory existed exclusively in Zagreb during the first half of the 20th century. Thus, in the first 13 years, Jugoton was the only record label in Yugoslavia that produced its own recordings and remained dominant on the record market for a long time. Due to the severe lack of data on different editions, sales, record prices, and buyers, it wasn't possible to closely define the Jugoton market. So in order to get the sense on how the ethnic record market functioned in Yugoslavia, I ended up determining the position and the role of such music within Jugoton's recorded core. On top of that, I explored how Jugoton presented different Yugoslav nationalities through recorded music with regards to repertoire, expression, and performers. Throughout this presentation, you'll be hearing fragments of, let's call it, potpourri of selected songs that will allow you to grasp the musical diversity of Yugoslav ethnicities. I would like to express my gratitude toward all diligent record collectors who made them accessible on their YouTube channels. The first 13 years of Jugoton Record Company's existence was still the time of Shellac records, hard and breakable records on 78 RPM. Jugoton replaced them with vinyl records within just 3 years, so at the beginning of 1960, Shellac record production ceased completely. Jugoton issued more than 700 hard records, whose convincing majority belongs to diverse ethnic or folk recordings. Today, more than 70 years after founding Jugoton, only a small part of once rather big recorded core has been more or less preserved. Last year, in order to locate, preserve, and unite the information on the remaining records, a couple of ethnomusicologists from Croatia, including our today's presenter Naila Ceribasic, started a project titled The Record Industry in Croatia from 1927 to the end of the 1950s. The project is supported by Croatian Science Foundation, and its headquarters are at the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Research in Zagreb. Work on the project includes a lot of physical and digital archive work, as well as valuable correspondence with collectors and, if possible, audience of 78 RPMs. We are also creating an online database which aims to unite all the information on Shellac records produced in Zagreb during the 20th century and optimally their recordings, grounding our information mainly on recorded labels and sales catalogs.
Rožica sam bila, rožica već ne bu. Dok mi leto mine, ja već sve ne bu. Rožica sam bila, rožica već ne bu. zvela nebu.
Rewinding to the end of the Second World War, we are back to Federative People's Republic of Yugoslavia. Socialist revolution occurred as a sort of reaction to fascist puppet state of NDH, or independent state of Croatia, and grounded itself on the remains of war-torn, mostly peasant and semi-literate society that needed to be fundamentally reconstructed. However, a strong Yugoslav bond with the Eastern Bloc didn't last long. Since Yugoslavian territory was at the time crucial in the Cold War between East and West, it couldn't possibly remain completely loyal to other socialist countries and their leader. So in 1948, Yugoslavian President Tito split with Stalin and pursued a foreign policy that did not align with the interests of the Eastern Bloc. This act firmly influenced socialist ideology in Yugoslavia and impacted all segments of Yugoslav policies, including the music and music production. In other words, although Yugoslavia was a closed socialist country with strict control over cultural consumption, its orientation to the West and dependence on financial help from the West gradually led leaders to accept diverse Western products. In music, it meant strengthening of jazz-influenced music, schlagers, canzonas, chansonas, various dances, and finally rock and roll, all at the expense of classical and folk music. This change is clearly visible in Jugoton's domestic production, as we will see a bit later. In 1947 and 1948, before the famous Tito-Stalin split, there was not a single example of popular music at all. In fact, this graph is a rather poor presentation of repertoire selection. Folk music convincingly dominates, so it's not surprising that allegedly the first record contained 2 Dalmatian folk songs. Partisan or communist songs were an important part of youth work actions, an essential part of all social events. Many communist songs gradually became folk songs, squeezing out a great number of traditional music, which was not in line with the new socialist politics. The same change occurred within folklore festivals that were continuously present from the 1920s onward. Thus, the term folk in these graphs implies carefully selected repertoire of mostly arranged folk songs that were in line with Yugoslav socialist ideology. Classical music in domestic production relied mainly on operettas, so the term classical in these graphs usually refers to songs from Croatian or foreign operettas. After Tito-Stalin split in 1948, the strict socialist ideology in Yugoslavia started to change according to their own needs and opportunities. Western products replaced the Soviet ones, and Yugoslavia became the only West-orientated socialist country at the time, which was not taken lightly by other socialist countries. Since officially it was still a socialist country with no rights on private ownership and desperately trying to indoctrinate new generations with brotherhood and unity ideology, its turn to the West had to be very careful and very subtle. For example, in terms of music, jazz was still not welcome, but its elements were broadly used in Yugoslav popular music. Another important change in Jugoton's administration occurred in 1951, when Yugoslav form of socialist self-management came into force. Jugoton was still a nationalized company, but with self-management, the administration got to use its own brain and started operating with the goal of economic gain. At that point, the economic gain legitimately overpowered the educational one. Yugoslavia slowly started to change into something that often raises the question whether it was really a communist country or its politics implemented a form of state capitalism. So in 1951, we can see a significant rise in popular music that was actually one of the only 2 genres issued by Jugoton at the beginning of the 1950s. The rise of the number of produced records in 1953 and 4 was thanks to the reconstruction within the plant, which brought 3 more gramophone record presses in Jugoton. In 1954, Jugoton saw an opportunity to expand on Hungarian market, so it started producing popular songs with Hungarian singers and in Hungarian language. I made a division in graphs, but these Hungarian songs are still a part of popular music core. Starting with 1955, popular music finally overpowered folk music. In 1956, Jugoton started producing long-playing records, and the next year all sorts of vinyl records emerged on the Yugoslav market. In 1958, we are witnessing the rising popular music industry in Yugoslavia. I have to emphasize that even though Yugoslavia largely imitated foreign popular music at the time, it also sought to create an original Yugoslav sound in popular music, relying on folk music. It was the time when Yugoslavia desperately tried to develop tourism and culture along the coast, turn workers into tourists, and create a perfect holiday destination. It's not clear whether it was primarily meant to create a new socialist man or to develop an economy in the country, but one thing remains certain. This state policy resulted in the emergence of a new popular genre inspired by folk music, in particular Dalmatian songs. The strong aftermath of this instance is still visible in contemporary Croatian domestic production that hugely relies on modern klapa ensembles and Dalmatian-inspired popular music. In other words, in 1958 and 1959, it was clear that Dalmatian folk song started to dominate the folk repertoire and slowly started to change, introducing more and more composed songs at the expense of traditional songs.
Proplakat će me zora i nebo sa zvizdama, a kamo neće draga, koju sam ljubio.
In order to see how were the 7 different Yugoslav ethnicities divided within Jugoton repertoire, I used the sales catalog from 1957. It encompasses years from 1949 to 1958. It's clear from the graph that Croatian folk music was the largest recorded core, followed by Slovenian, Serbian, Bosnian, and finally Macedonian folk music. Kosovo and Montenegrin folk music were recorded in a symbolic number on 4 and 2 records. It's very important to stress that this graph is a result of economic power within Yugoslavia, and not the political one. In other words, even though one might expect Serbian folk music to be, if not on the first, then at least on the second place, since Serbian capital Belgrade was the capital of Yugoslavia as well. More so if we take into account that the political power of Serbia overpowered that of Slovenia. This Yugoton's turn to economic power instead of political one highlighted capitalist business model, or money-driven policy, within this record company. Economic power played a very important role in the record industry, since its market was conditioned by the number of gramophones that circulated in public and private spheres. On the other hand, political influence could be sought in the tendency to fragment nations and regions as a way to prevent nationalism. This could justify the existence of Kosovo and Montenegrin music being recorded in spite of having no economic power to notably purchase these records. Similar policy could be tracked in Soviet record industry, as Pekka Gronov suggested, dealing with the music of Soviet minorities. He emphasized the fact that when a record was listed in a Soviet record catalog, it didn't mean that it was stocked by the manufacturer and generally available in record stores. It only meant that the particular item has once been issued and could again be made available for retail trade and export if sufficiently large demand was received to warrant a new pressing.
Oj, coko, coko, crno oko, crvena jabuko. Oj, coko,
Kradem ti se u večeri pod penđeri.
Croatian folk music production in Jugoton was mostly divided in three regions: Dalmatia, Slavonia, and Croatia, which implied Zagorje and Međimurje region in the northern Croatia. The folk music of other regions was almost completely ignored and left out of record production. The filters for this could be various, one of them surely being the attractive nature of folk music. Thus, all recorded folk music in Jugoton production featured noticeably stylized expression. Dalmatia was represented completely through songs performed mainly by male vocal ensembles accompanied by mandolin ensembles. Slavonian and Croatian part had a small core of folk dances recorded, but they were also mainly presented through vocal music accompanied by gradually growing tamburica ensembles. Until 1958, a majority of recorded music in Croatia was classified as traditional. There was, however, one exception of 78 RPMs that contained recordings of folk music from this Croatian region. The music was recorded on 5 records in the series titled Ethnophilia. This was a work of Croatian ethnomusicologist Nedjeljko Karabajic, who wrote a book in 1956 focusing on the folk music of Istria and Croatian littoral. Slovenian folk music was not divided in regions within Jugoton music production, but it did have one distinctive element. Half of the recorded core was vocal music, and half of it consisted of various dances such as polka, waltz, mazurka, and march. Almost half of recorded Slovenian folk music was composed, which definitely puts it on the top of other Yugoslav nations regarding that aspect. Somewhat like Croatian, a Serbian folk music was also divided into different regions, omitting a notable part of other Serbian regions. It mostly consists of vocal music accompanied by accordion or various folk orchestras, where violin and accordion play an important role. The composed folk music core gradually increased towards the end of the 1950s and became the cradle of so-called newly composed folk music, which quickly became mass culture. Bosnian folk music comprises vocal music or traditional urban folk songs called sevdalinka, regularly accompanied by accordion. It was not rare to compose sevdalinka, but since they were so popular, the composer was regularly omitted and composition became a proper traditional song. The representative Macedonian music comprises fast, energetic music performed by folk ensembles. Recorded majority were songs, and all of them were classified as traditional. Montenegrin folk music was issued on only 2 records. Those are Montenegrin songs performed by Serbian singers and ensembles. And finally, Kosovo was represented by their great singer Nežmija Pagaruša, who recorded 4 songs on 2 records. The other 2 Kosovo folk music records feature a Serbian singer performing traditional Kosovo song.
Veliko pagofaler vijava nama, tihalja se kihažu.
One important policy all record companies still have is to issue a record with an attractive sound. After the Second World War, attractiveness became an important part of folklore festivals as well. In other words, as Naila Ceribasic emphasized in her book on folklore festivals in Croatia, during that time new adjectives regarding performers on the folklore festivals emerged, such as uniform, correct, representative, and trained. It also became preferable to play folk music with the music sheet, which is completely unthinkable from today's point of view. Folklore ensembles playing without the sheet were graded worse. In spite of the fact folk ensembles perfected themselves in performance, Jugoton played it safe. It did not employ amateur folk ensembles for folk music, but verified professional musicians and singers usually connected to Radio Zagreb, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Skopje, or Novi Sad. Even Slovenian Philharmonic Choir was employed. Many of the performers are still remembered as icons of traditional music in all Yugoslavian countries. And finally, even though this was a preliminary research on Jugoton folk music production and the market, it is safe to conclude that Jugoton did implement money-driven policy in its music production even as early as in the 1950s. If folk music hadn't been making out an important part of annual sales, it would soon be squeezed out by rising popular music, just as it happened to classical music. By the end of the 1950s, folk music was still the leading genre in Jugoton's production, and its influence on later domestic music production was and still is notable. I would like to add just a few final sentences for today's audience. All recordings you've heard today were downloaded from various YouTube channels, originally digitized and uploaded by passionate collectors. Almost all Jugoton 78s are still kept in the Croatia Records Archive, company that succeeded Jugoton in the 1990s. These records are not yet digitized, nor available to the public. Jugoton ethnic recordings on shellac and later on vinyl were rather important to Yugoslav diaspora all over the world. We have found several Jugoton recordings issued in the US by Slav Art Music Company and Balkan Records. There are also some examples from the South America. French disc Vogue produced vinyl recordings of Kosovo singer Nejmija Pagarusha, originally issued on Jugoton 78s. These examples present a valuable trace in further research on Jugoton market outside of the Yugoslav borders. So I would like to use this opportunity to draw attention to all collectors in the ARSC that have maybe came across records or recordings produced on ex-Yugoslav territory to kindly reach out at projektdiskograf@gmail.com. We would be very grateful for any additional information on this matter. That would be all for today. Thank you all for your attention.